Hello everybody and welcome to another video. This week we reach back in time, or for us, the future, to the 31st millennium where the Horus Heresy is raging and we will be painting some Dark Angels. Let's go. I say Dark Angels plural, but it's actually Dark Angel singular. And in this case, he's not actually a Dark Angel, he is a Black Lion from Dakka Dakka Store, who reached out to me on Instagram and asked me to paint one up for them. And I said, yeah, can I also make a video because I want to paint some Heresy Dark Angels, and this is perfect timing. So for full transparency, I was paid to paint the model for their advertising campaign, but they did not ask me to give any kind of one-way review, and they didn't ask me to make this video, so every opinion I have about the model is 100% my own. So with that in mind, this guy is just one of the Black Lions range that they're releasing. I'm going to put a link to the Kickstarter in the description. I really like the model, there's a good level of detail without being overwhelming, and it meant that I could paint this guy in fairly short order and still have a pretty good effect. Once I'd built and primed him, it was time to crack on with the actual painting, and I'm using these shades of black and blue to create a really nice, slightly non-metallic metal armour. If you've been around my channel for any amount of time, then you'll know that ages ago I did a video that hasn't aged particularly well because of the camera work on Black Templars, and this is a very similar scheme. I'm using a mix of black and the equivalent of Incubi Darkness from Vallejo, which is Dark Sea Blue, to create a nice base layer. This model is actually really forgiving to paint when it comes to doing this type of scheme because his arms are pointing towards the sky, which means where the light's going to be hitting is really simple to work out. Because of the way he's posed, I was able to follow along the top of his arms where that light would be hitting with a mix of dark sea blue and black, and then go back in with regular dark sea blue right afterwards. Every time we go up a shade in colour, so closer to those highlights, we're going to be covering a smaller and smaller area. We've now reached the point where the Dark Sea Blue has gone away, and I've moved on to a bit of Dark Reaper and Field Blue to start highlighting that model. I think this is a really important stage to get right. We're chunking out our initial edge highlights, so take our time, we'll get there eventually, and if you get this stage right, the follow-on steps are much faster. You find this process speeds up as you go through. This model does have a fair amount of trim around the elbows and on the wrist guards, and I could have painted these in a metallic colour, but I decided to stay on brand and keep painting them in the same way as the rest of the armour. I often find if you keep things simple like this by staying with the same colour, the painting process is that much faster, and you don't have to worry about metallic paint seeping into the rest of your hard work. Now as we break out the undiluted field blue, I'm going to be adding those bar highlights and making them a little bit sharper across those cylindrical objects like his arm, and also across the top of the backpack. When doing an object a bit like a backpack, you don't want to put the highlight right on top. Think about how light kind of bounces off objects. It's hard to visualize, but the more you practice and as you look at things in nature, you start to understand what I mean. At this point, I'm just going back and forth between a few of my colours to make sure everything's neat and tidy before we move on to the next step, which is actually really simple but really satisfying. Once we've completed the highlights, we're going to be breaking out a contrast paint and thinning it down with either a medium or some water. I personally use water and never really noticed the difference, as long as you don't go too thin, because otherwise it then starts to break up. Here I'm using contrast Pterodon turquoise, and I'm putting a glaze all over the areas we've just painted. The more medium you add, the more subtle the effect will be. I've gone sort of 50-50 here, and you could definitely go lighter, but I really like the quite cartoony effect that comes out of this, and in my opinion, more colour added to black is always better. I always really enjoy this part, it's really easy to do, and it starts to bring everything together and look quite cohesive, so that's always a win in my book. The final stage is to switch to Fenrisian Grey from Citadel, which is our brightest highlight, and make a nice sharp highlight all over those areas that are highest on the model. With the glaze now dry underneath, as we're adding these highlights, the model's really starting to pop. This is another really satisfying stage that takes slightly longer, but is absolutely worthwhile. You could definitely push it further than I am here using blue horror or whites, but I'm not going to go that far because otherwise I feel that the model starts to look a little bit washed out. So this method of painting, as I mentioned, is kind of a faux non-metallic metal. It's not quite there, you don't go quite as bright to make it look really like metal, but I think it's a nice in-between that is a little bit extra effort than the normal base coat shade highlight, but is absolutely worth it. I use this on my Black Templars as mentioned, and I do recommend it for any of those armies with black armour. You could also do this with greys to make a different effect, or any other colour that goes well with black. Green is also quite nice and is a sister colour to the blue that we've got here. Now moving on from all those blacks and blues, we're going to bring some red into the scheme and cover off all the shoulder trim with some corn red from Citadel. Now the main focus of the mini, which I think is the armour, though it could also be the cloak in this situation, is done. I'm going to go through a quick stage of base coating a fair few bits. As mentioned, starting with the shoulder trims, but I'm also going to base coat the entire cloak getup that he's wearing in some pale grey blue from Vallejo. This colour over black will definitely require 2 coats. Whilst the 2 coats on the outer cloak are drying, I'm going to highlight the inner cloak and keep that black by using German grey and basalt grey. Just using some greys to make it look very different to the armour. Likewise, trying to keep the guy looking a little bit moody, I did the exact same thing on the hood. Now moving on to some very simple highlights, I kept this nice and easy on the cloak and kept it very clean by using AK Silver Grey to highlight the nicely defined folds in the fabric. Continuing with our highlights, we're moving back to the shoulder pads, and this time we're using Evil Sun's Scarlet to create a nice saturated red highlight. That's in keeping with the rest of the model, which is also quite saturated at this stage. Now something I should have done earlier, I'm going to paint the sword in the same pale grey blue because we're going to be adding some fun contrast colours to this later. Whilst that base coat on the sword is drying, I'm going to start using Rhinox hide to base coat all of the leather areas and also all of the areas that I want to be gold. And we'll come back to those in a second because we're going to do some non-metallic metal on those. We're also going to do the same with all the other metal areas but using greys. After I base coated all of those gold areas in brown, I went in with Mournfang Brown and added my first layer of highlights. I'm covering a lot of the Rhinox hide but making sure plenty of it is still visible in the shadows. You'll notice that metal goes from dark to very bright very quickly when there's sun shining on it, so it's important that we keep those dark shadows in place. The best thing I can say about practicing non-metallic metal is just to practice it. Do it again and again and again, and start by doing small areas like the sword hilt here, and you will improve. The next highlight colour is Baylor Brown, which is much brighter than the previous 2 colours, but again we're covering a fairly large area, making sure that gradient from our previous colours is still visible. After this, we're moving straight up to quite a bright highlight by using Ushabti Bone to create our really bright spot areas. I'm creating this in a bit of a bar shape like I did on the arm, but making sure it's all cohesive on the sword, and where the light would be hitting the sword is where those brightest highlights are. The final step after the Ushabti Bone stage is to use an even brighter colour. I'm going to use Pale Sand from Vallejo to do my final highlights. After all this is done, you could use a glaze like we did on the armour to change the tone of the metal, so often I quite like to use a yellow, but in this case I left it as it was because I thought it was a nice effect. As mentioned previously, we're doing the exact same thing on all those silver metallic areas, starting with the same colours we used to highlight the undercloak and moving all the way up to AK Silver Grey to make sure there's a really bright, sharp highlight. Back to the sword, those 2 coats have now dried, and we're going to be using Warp Lightning to give it a nice green tint. Then we're going to be highlighting with Moot Green and then bits of Livery Green, which is the Vallejo colour, just to create some nice sharp highlights, as we've done on all of the rest of the model. The final step for the sword is to tidy it up slightly with a little bit more Warp Lightning. Now, with the sword done, we're very nearly done. It's just time for a quick bit of basing, and I think this is going to add a lot to the model when we start adding some pigments. I'm using a texture paste from AK, which I think is their Light Earth. I can't remember at the time of recording, but it's a decent little paste for this. And then we're going to be breaking out some Abtai Lung 502 pigments in the form of Vietnam Earth and a dry brush. I'm going to be adding this all over the base, making sure it's neat and tidy and not touching the sword, and then we're going to start adding it to the cloak so it looks like he's been walking through a bit of a dusty desert. So with that, the model is done. We just need to tidy up the base rim in just a second with some Black Legion. Big thanks to Dakka Dakka Store for reaching out and sending this model out to me so I could paint him. I had a really good time. If you're interested in finding out more about this range, there are also some proxies for the Black Lion's enemies, if you know who they are, and you can find the link in the description to the Kickstarter. I hope you've enjoyed this video. It gave me an excuse to paint some Dark Angels in Heresy colours, and I am excited to perhaps go a little bit further with this, but we'll see. I've routinely been against the Dark Angels, but they've been growing on me more and more, especially with their poor performance in 40k, endearing me to them. Thank you so much to everyone for watching. Thank you once again to my channel members. You guys are absolute legends. I've been Sam. See you next time.